to the source of the internet itself. It could be that your ISP is restricting your Wi-Fi upload speeds, or that you have reached
taken from the streets of Calcutta. She won the Nobel Peace Prize and was later canonized as Saint Teresa of Calcutta. When she died in 1997, India gave her a state funeral on the same ceremonial carriage that had carried Gandhi. But in the past few decades, for millions, her reputation has been torn apart. First led by writer and journalist Christopher Hitchens, who beat her up with a tough documentary and never stopped punching until he died. These days, you can find her on social media with devil horns and outraged comment sections. So which is it? Is she a sinner or a genuine saint? I'm Ken LaCourte. I dig into uncomfortable topics like this to give you as fair of an answer as I can. I went through a lot of charges and a lot of rebuttals. We'll kick off with what she actually did, because the setting for her actions, it matters a lot. Then we'll get into the medical care questions and the serious charges there against her. We'll ask, where did the money go? And then we'll take a look at what some critics call her toxic associations. Finally, we'll take a step back to see the big picture. Do her critics have fair points? Or is this anti-religious zealotry and the internet taking down a nun for sport? So to understand what she actually did, we first need to picture Calcutta in the late 1940s. Because without that context, the charges against her are pretty unfair. Agnes Bojashu came from Skopje to India in 1929 at age 19. She had no medical training, no money, and had come to teach school. 20 years later, she founded the Missionaries of Charity to care for the dying. She started with a single donated house in 1950, and by the time she died, that had grown to over 600 missions in 123 countries. When she arrived, Calcutta was one of the most densely packed cities on earth, and it was coming apart at the seams. The partition of India in 1947 pushed millions of refugees into an already overwhelmed city. People in the final stages of tuberculosis, cancer, and leprosy, they were literally dying in the gutters by the thousands. Under the prevailing caste norms, many Hindus considered touching a dying stranger ritually polluting. Combined with poverty and overcrowding, most people simply kept walking. There was no functioning public system to care for the dying poor in the streets. Hospitals often turned away patients who were beyond treating, especially if they were poor and alone. So that was the world that Mother Teresa moved to. 2 years after she started her charity, the city donated a space, 2 large halls, about 80 beds, and that became the home for the dying. People were pulled off the streets, brought inside, given food and water and compassion. They were held. They didn't die alone. But what it didn't offer was medical triage, trained clinical care, or meaningful pain management much beyond aspirin. Mother Teresa was clear about this from the beginning. This was a place to die with dignity and to be loved, not a place to be healed. And that the framing there was religious, not medical. By her own account, about 29,000 people died in that house. That's a population of a city living their last days with the nuns. Okay, now flash forward a few decades to the critics. The most serious charges against Mother Teresa were medical care questions about what actually happened inside her homes. Specifically, did the people she took off the street get adequate care, and should that care have changed after her resources grew? But first, how did a nun toiling in India become beloved throughout the world? Television. Her notoriety hit the world stage through a 1969 BBC documentary, Something Beautiful for God. It was directed by Malcolm Muggeridge, then the most prominent religious broadcaster in Britain. He was also a recent religious convert. When the film aired, Muggeridge said that the reaction was greater than anything he'd seen in his broadcasting career. That one documentary launched her global fame, and the world ran with it. In 1979, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. She turned down the traditional Nobel banquet and asked that its costs be redirected to the poor. By the mid-1980s, she was possibly the most famous woman on Earth and essentially untouchable. The first sustained public challenge came from Christopher Hitchens through his 1994 documentary called Hell's Angel. He later wrote a short book with the deliberately offensive title, The Missionary Position. Now, for context, know that Hitchens was a committed atheist who believed that organized religion actively harmed humanity. And he was openly furious at her positions on contraception and abortion. He called her a Catholic fanatic. That doesn't make his facts wrong, but it's important to know that going in. What Hitchens reported after visiting her homes was no meaningful pain relief for terminally ill patients, no medical triage, with the dying and the potentially treatable mixed together, reused needles washed in cold water, and poor hygiene throughout. He also charged that her theology, framing suffering as spiritually redemptive, was applied to people who hadn't made that choice and who weren't in a position to refuse. He had more charges against her, which we'll get into, about finances and associations. But his core conclusion was that she wasn't a friend of the poor, she was a friend of poverty. Now, Hitchens came at this with a hatred towards religion, but that wasn't the case with Dr. Robin Fox. He was the editor of The Lancet, perhaps the world's most prestigious medical journal. He also visited and wrote about the Home for the Dying. He opened by acknowledging real strengths. The home was clean. Wounds and sores were carefully tended. Patients were well fed. The nuns showed genuine kindness, and the facility kept an open-door policy that took in people who were turned away by the hospitals. But his medical criticisms were direct. No strong pain relief, like morphine. Needles that weren't properly sterilized. Haphazard diagnosis, and untrained volunteers making medical decisions in the near absence of doctors. He too noted that people who might have survived with proper treatment were sometimes mixed in along with the dying. British volunteer Mary Loudon had also worked at the home for years. Her account, and criticisms from an insider's point of view, aligned with Fox's medical findings. Also, in 2005, Donald McIntyre, an undercover British journalist, spent a week at the Missionary of Charity's orphanage for disabled children, and he documented children gagged open to receive medicine and babies bound at feeding time. Credibility-wise, to me he's in a bit of a gray area. He was a legitimate investigative reporter, but he had a, let's say, flair for the sensational. And throughout his career,